Princess Silvara was standing near the tall window at the far end of the room, looking out over the city below. She still wore her formal robes from the session. A half-finished goblet of dark liquid sat on the table beside her. She did not turn around when he entered. "Dreneth," she said. Her voice was calm and flat, the way it always was. "This had better be worth interrupting my evening." "Your Highness," he said, and stopped just inside the door. "It is." She turned then, reading his face in the way she read every room, quickly, precisely, looking for the information that wasn't being said out loud. Whatever she found in his expression, it was enough to make her cross the room and sit down at the table. She gestured for him to take the seat across from her. He sat. He placed the data slate on the table between them, but kept his hand on it for a moment. "What I am about to show you," he said, "is classified at the highest level of the Intelligence Division. It has never been shared with the court. It has never been formally presented to the Council. There are fewer than 12 people in the Dominion who have read it." Silvara said nothing. She waited. "It concerns humanity," Dreneth said. The princess blinked once, then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "The cradle world," she said. "You requested an emergency audience at this hour because of the cradle world? Please read it, Your Highness." She looked at him for another moment. Then she took the data slate. She started reading. For the first few minutes, her expression did not change. The early sections of the file were historical records of Earth from a distance, observations of their early civilization, notes on their biology and development. She scrolled through them with the steady, efficient pace of someone who was humoring a subordinate and expected to be done quickly. Then she slowed down. The file moved into a section labeled Conflict Records, Terran Species, High Priority Review. She read about the first extinction event, a catastrophic impact from space roughly 66 million years ago that had killed most of the complex life on their planet. Many civilizations would have ended there. The planet would have recovered eventually, over millions of years, and something new would have grown from the wreckage. It happened all the time across the galaxy. It was simply how things went. Humanity's ancestor species survived. They were small and fragile and had no particular advantage, and they survived. They spread. They adapted. And over millions of years, they grew into the species that was now sitting in her assembly hall with a small gray ship and a polite speech. She read about the second near extinction, this one self-inflicted. Humanity had, at one point in its history, nearly destroyed its own world with weapons of its own creation. The file included intelligence records of the event from monitoring satellites the Dominion had placed in that region of space centuries ago. The projections at the time had estimated a very high probability of complete civilizational collapse. The analysts who had written the report had closed the file and moved on, expecting nothing further from that world. They had been wrong. Humanity had pulled back from the edge slowly and badly and with great difficulty. But they had done it. They had rebuilt. They had kept going. Silvara's pace slowed further. Her eyes moved across the words more carefully now. Then she reached the section on the Korathi, the Swarm. She knew about the Korathi. Every civilization in the galaxy knew about the Korathi. They were a consuming force, not intelligent in the way most species were, but organized in the way a storm was organized, driven by a single, endless hunger. They had swept through 3 star systems and wiped them completely clean before the wider galaxy had understood what was happening. By the time a response was organized, most civilizations in the affected region had already fallen or fled. The Veldrone had retreated. The Salin Collective had abandoned 2 of their outer colonies. Even 2 minor Velari frontier stations had been evacuated as a precaution. Humanity had not retreated. They were in the path of the swarm with a fleet that was by any measure far too small for the task. They had no allies left in the region. They had no fallback position that made sense. Every military model the Dominion's analysts had run at the time showed complete Terran defeat within weeks. Instead, humanity had fought the Korathi Swarm to a standstill. Then they pushed back. Then, in a single operation that the Dominion's intelligence files described in careful and still confused detail, they had destroyed the swarm's central breeding structure and ended the threat entirely. The operation had been led by one individual. Savara kept reading. She read about the war with the Veldrone Collective, 40 years of conflict, grinding and brutal, between humanity and an empire 10 times their size. The Veldrone had expected a quick victory. They had not gotten one. Humanity had fought on supply lines that should have been impossible to maintain. They had improvised solutions to problems that should have broken them. They had lost ground and taken it back and lost it again and taken it back again. And after 40 years, it was the Veldrone who had asked for terms. She read about the siege of Proxima Station, where a Veldrone force had locked down the most strategically important human outpost in the outer systems. Military projections from multiple civilizations who had been watching from a careful distance had estimated the siege would last between 200 and 300 years before any realistic resolution. It had lasted 11 days. One man had ended it. Savara's hand was very still on the data slate. Now she read the name for the third time in the file. She had passed over it the first 2 times, focused on the events themselves. Now she stopped. She read it slowly. Commander Ethan Voss. She looked up at Drenith. This is one man, she said. Not a question, a statement that she seemed to be testing the weight of. Yes, Your Highness. These events, the Korathi operation, the Veldrone ceasefire, the Proxima siege, all of them list the same name. Yes. She looked back down at the file. She turned to the final page, a standard status report updated just 3 days ago. Standard escort and security assignment, diplomatic mission, Velthar Prime. Her eyes stopped on the last line. The room was very quiet. On the table, her goblet sat untouched. Then, without any dramatic movement, without any particular expression on her face, her hand brushed the edge of the table, and the goblet tipped and fell. It hit the floor. Dark liquid spread slowly across the pale stone. Neither of them moved to pick it up. He is here, Savara said. Her voice was the exact same as before, flat and controlled, but it was the kind of control that takes effort. He arrived this morning, Drenith said, escorting Ambassador Hideran. He was in the hall today, Your Highness, the entire time. Savara set the data slate down on the table very carefully. She looked at the window, at the city outside, at the light spread out below in the dark. Tomorrow, she said at last, I want every senior delegate briefed to stay calm regardless of what they see. I want my personal guard doubled, and I want you in that hall before the session opens. Of course, Drenith said. Is there anything else? The princess did not answer immediately. She was still looking at the window. The man in the gray uniform, she said quietly. He was standing against the back wall. Yes. He never sat down. No, Drenith said. He never does. The morning of the second session arrived gray and quiet over Velthar Prime. The great city outside the assembly hall moved through its usual rhythms, transport vessels crossing the sky in long, slow lines, markets opening below the towers, the distant hum of a world that had been doing the same things for 3,000 years and saw no reason to change. It was a city that had never known real fear. It sat epicenter of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and it wore that fact the way old money wore fine clothes, without thinking about it at all. Inside the hall, things were different. The delegates began arriving earlier than usual, not because the session was scheduled to start early. It wasn't. They arrived early because word moved through the guest quarters of the Dominion's diplomatic residences the way fire moves through dry grass. Quietly at first, then faster, then all at once. No one could say exactly where it had started. A whisper here, a careful question there, a name passed between two delegates in a corridor at some point before dawn, spoken low and quickly, the way you say something you are not sure you should be saying out loud. By the time the hall's doors opened for the morning session, the atmosphere inside was nothing like the day before. The Velari delegation, who had been laughing quietly at the Terran delegation the previous afternoon, arrived in a tight, silent group and took their seats without looking toward the Terran section at all. The Salin Collective's senior ambassador, a tall figure who had spent the previous session leaning back in his seat with the comfortable ease of someone who owned the room, arrived early, sat down straight, and spent a long time studying his own prepared notes with unusual focus. Two delegates from a minor civilization called the Harath, who had no particular history with humanity one way or another, quietly asked a floor attendant if their seats could be moved 2 rows further from the Terran section. The attendant, confused, said he would look into it. Kolaharan arrived with his small team at exactly the scheduled time, not a minute early and not a minute late. He walked to the tan bench, sat down, opened his writing pad, and looked around the room with the calm, observant expression of a man who notices everything and reacts to very little. He noted the changed atmosphere. He noted the early arrivals. He noted the careful... He was watching a side door on the far right of the hall that had opened slightly for a maintenance worker and then closed again. His eyes came back to the center of the room, finished their sweep, and found, probably without particular surprise, that the princess of the Velari Dominion was standing 6 meters away, looking directly at him. He met her gaze. His expression did not change. The hall had gone very quiet. Not the formal quiet of a session in progress, the sharp, sudden quiet of 300 people who all stopped breathing at the same moment because something unexpected was happening, and no one was sure what came next. Zavara held his gaze for 1 second. Then she did something that no delegate in that hall had ever seen her do, something that several of them would spend years afterward trying to describe accurately to people who had not been present. She stepped forward, and she dropped to 1 knee. Not a small token gesture, not a slight incline of the head that could later be described as something else. She went down on 1 knee on the stone floor of her own assembly hall in front of every delegate from every civilization in the known galaxy, and she held that position. The silence in the room became something physical. It had weight. It pressed against the walls. "Commander Voss," she said. Her voice was clear and even and carried perfectly through the silent hall. "The Velari Dominion acknowledges your presence." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan Voss gave a small, single nod. It was the same nod he might have given a colleague passing him in a corridor back on Earth. Unhurried, unremarkable, completely unbothered by the fact that the ruler of 12 star systems was currently kneeling on the floor in front of him. "Ma'am," he said. That was all. Just the one word, calm and quiet, and carrying absolutely nothing extra. Savara rose. She straightened her robes with one smooth motion, turned, and continued walking to her throne as if nothing had happened. She sat down. She looked out across the hall. No one spoke. Then slowly, the room began to breathe again. Whispers started tight, fast, urgent whispers in a dozen different languages, all of them saying more or less the same thing in different words. The Velari senior delegate had gone pale. One of the Salin ambassadors had put his prepared notes face down on the bench in front of him and was not looking at them anymore. The 2 Harath delegates who had asked to move their seats were now simply staring at the back wall with wide, still eyes. Kolharan sat back down in his seat. He looked at his writing pad. He wrote 2 words, underlined them once, and allowed himself a very small, private smile that no one around him was paying enough attention to notice. At the back of the hall, Ethan Voss had already returned to watching the exits. The session ended early that afternoon. Princess Zavara had called a recess before the midpoint of the scheduled proceedings, which was something that had never happened at a Sovereignty Conclave in recorded history. The herald had announced it in a careful, neutral voice, as if it were a completely normal thing, and the delegates had filed out of the hall in the kind of stunned, uncertain silence that followed an earthquake, not panicked, but shaken in a way that made everyone move a little more carefully than usual. Savara did not go to her throne room. She did not go to her private chambers. She walked directly to the War Council chamber on the 3rd level of the palace, a deep and windowless room built from the same dark starstone as the hall below, and she sat down at the head of the long black table and told her staff to send for Overseer Drenth and no one else. He arrived within minutes. He had been expecting the summons. She did not ask him to sit. She leaned forward with her hands flat on the table and looked at him across its length. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the file, not the summary. Tell me what you know in your own words from the beginning." Drenth stood at the far end of the table, and he told her. He told her about the Korathi Swarm first, because that was where any honest account of Ethan Voss had to begin. The swarm had entered human space moving fast and consuming everything. Most of the Terran outer colonies in the affected region had already been evacuated by the time the military response was organized. Humanity's leadership knew, looking at the numbers, that a direct engagement was likely to fail. Their fleet was too small. Their technology at that time was still developing. The logical move, the move that every other civilization in the region had already made, was to fall back, protect the core worlds, and hope the swarm changed direction. Humanity's military command had agreed that the logical move was to fall back. Then, a mid-ranking officer named Ethan Voss had submitted a plan that was, by every formal measure, completely unreasonable. It required 37 soldiers. It required entering Korathi hive space, not in a warship, but in a small, stripped-down vessel that would read as debris on most long-range scans. It required navigating through the densest part of the swarm's occupied territory on foot through tunnels that no outside species had ever mapped to reach the breeding core at the center of the hive structure, and then it required destroying it. His commanding officers had looked at the plan for a long time. Then they had approved it. 37 soldiers went in, 37 soldiers came out. The breeding core was destroyed. The Korathi Swarm, without its central structure driving it forward, collapsed in on itself within weeks. The war was over. Military analysts from 4 different civilizations, including the Dominion's own, had reviewed the after-action records later when they became available. None of them had been able to produce a model that satisfactorily explained how the operation succeeded. The variables were too many. The margins were too small. The decisions made inside that hive structure in the dark and without communication had been so precisely correct so many times in a row that several analysts had simply written the word unexplainable in their final reports and left it there. Zavara listened without interrupting. Drenth moved on to the Veldran War. 40 years. She knew the broad shape of it from general history, but the details in the intelligence file were sharper and stranger. Humanity had been outmatched in almost every category that military science used to measure such things: fleet size, industrial capacity, population, territorial depth. The Veldran Collective had gone into that conflict expecting it to last at most a few years. They had found instead a species that seemed to become more dangerous the longer the fight went on. Not because they kept finding more resources, they didn't. Not because their technology suddenly improved. It improved slowly, the way it always had, but because they kept finding new ways to use what they already had. New tactics, new solutions. Things that should not have worked but did over and over, just enough times to matter. And then there was Proxima Station. Veldran had taken Proxima Station in the 38th year of the war. It was the single most strategically important outpost in humanity's outer system network, and losing it had been a serious blow. The Veldran fleet holding the station was large, well supplied, and deeply entrenched. Their commanders had looked at the situation and concluded, correctly by any standard analysis, that no human force could retake the station within any reasonable time frame. They were prepared for a very long wait. Ethan Voss arrived on the 11th day with no fleet, no assault force, and no weapons visible on his vessel. He requested to board the flagship alone for a meeting. The Veldran commander agreed, mostly out of curiosity. It seemed like an interesting way to spend an afternoon talking to a human who had come to a battle with no army. He had assumed it would be a surrender negotiation of some kind. What was said in that room for 3 hours between one human and the command staff of the Veldran fleet had never been recorded. Voss had carried no recording equipment, and the Veldran had chosen afterward not to share what had been discussed.
The only record that exists is a single line in the Veldran commander's personal log, written the night after the meeting. It had been obtained by Dominion intelligence through channels that Drenith did not go into. The line read, "He told us things we did not know we knew. I cannot explain it better than that." The next morning, the entire Veldran fleet had pulled back from Proxima Station, not just from the station, from the entire outer system. Within 3 months, the Veldran Collective had formally requested peace terms, ending a war on terms that, by any honest reading, favored humanity considerably. The room was very quiet when Drenith finished. Savara had not moved from her position at the head of the table. Her hands were still flat on the surface. Her eyes had not left Drenith's face. "He is not the strongest species," she said slowly. "He does not have the largest fleet. He is not the most advanced." "No," Drenith said. "Then what is he?" Drenith thought about this carefully before answering. He had thought about this many times over the years, and he had never found an answer that felt completely right, but he had found one that felt closest. "He is human," Drenith said. "That is the only answer the file gives. He adapts, he improvises, he is patient in a way that does not look like patience from the outside. It looks like stubbornness or foolishness or simply not understanding when something is supposed to be impossible. And because of that, no one can model him. No strategic system, no military computer, no experienced commander from any civilization has ever successfully predicted what he will do next. And that, Your Highness, is more dangerous than any weapon." Savara was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the night before, since the goblet hit the floor, since she had read the last line of the file. "Why did we not know about this?" she said. "Why was this file never brought to the court? Why did I walk into that hall yesterday knowing nothing about this man?" Drenith's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. It was not quite discomfort. It was closer to the look of a person who has to deliver the part of the story that changes everything. Because approximately 4 years ago,
The people of Earth are grateful for this invitation and for the time this conclave has given us to be present here among so many great civilizations. He paused for just a moment. We have thought carefully about what we would like to say at this session, and we have decided to say it simply. He stepped forward and placed the data chip on the edge of the platform. Then he slid it forward gently with 2 fingers across the polished stone surface until it came to rest in front of the throne. "That is a proposed mutual sovereignty accord," he said. "It outlines a relationship between Earth and the Velari Dominion built on equal standing. Not tribute, not membership, partnership. We are not here to join the Dominion. We are here to stand beside it, if the Dominion is willing to stand beside us." He stepped back. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. For a moment, the hall did nothing. Then it erupted, not in applause, in noise. The kind of noise that happens when 300 people from 32 different civilizations all try to express strong feelings at the same time through translation devices that were not designed for chaos. It was a wall of sound, objections, questions, sharp exchanges between delegates who had not spoken to each other all session, the rapid clicking and humming of alien languages running over each other. Several delegates were on their feet. The Dravari senior delegate was speaking loudly to no one in particular about the rules of the conclave. 2 of the smaller civilizations near the back had simply turned to each other and were having what appeared to be a very urgent private conversation. At the center of all of it, Cole Heron stood completely still and waited. Silvara raised one hand. The noise stopped, not gradually, immediately, like a light being switched off. The entire hall went silent in the space of 1 second, because that was what her raised hand meant in this room, and everyone in it knew it. She looked at the data chip sitting in front of her throne. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then her eyes moved just once to the back wall of the hall, to the gray uniform, to the man standing there, who was even now, in the middle of the most politically charged moment the conclave had seen in a century, calmly watching the side exits. She thought about everything she had read in the file. She thought about 37 soldiers walking into a hive structure in the dark. She thought about a single man boarding an enemy flagship alone with no weapons and walking out 3 hours later with a war's end in his pocket. She thought about a species that had been struck down twice, once by the universe and once by itself, and had gotten back up both times and kept building. She thought about what Drenth had said. He adapts. He is patient in a way that looks like stubbornness from the outside. She reached forward and picked up the data chip. She held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the small, flat weight of it. Then she pressed it to the reading surface on the arm of her throne, pulled up the document, and read through it. The hall remained perfectly silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The herald, standing to the left of the platform, looked as though he was not sure what to do with his hands. Silvara read to the end of the document. Then she reached into the holder on the throne's right arm and took out the formal Dominion seal, a small tool that, when pressed to a document, carried the full legal authority of the Velari crown. She had used it hundreds of times. It was a routine action. She pressed it to the data chip. The seal confirmed with a soft tone. The mutual sovereignty accord between the Velari Dominion and the people of Earth was now legally binding. The noise that followed was entirely different from the noise before. It was quieter in a way, but heavier. The sound of people processing something that they had not expected and were not sure yet how to feel about. The sound of a room in which the shape of something very large had just permanently changed. Cole Heron gave a small, respectful nod toward the throne. Then he turned and walked back to the tan bench, picked up his writing pad, and sat down. When the session ended and the delegates began filing out, Silvara came down from the platform and walked toward the Terran row. The crowd around her parted automatically. She stopped near the back of the Terran row and waited as Cole Heron gathered his things. Then she looked past him one more time to where Voss was preparing to follow the delegation out. "Commander," she said quietly. He stopped. He looked at her. She asked him the question she had been carrying since the night she had read the file. Not as a princess, not as a ruler calculating the next move, simply as a person who wanted a real answer. "Were you ever actually in danger here?" Ethan Voss considered the question. Not for long, but genuinely, the way he considered everything, without performance and without hurry. "I'm always in danger, Your Highness," he said. "I just don't let it change anything." He gave a small, respectful nod. The same small nod he had given in the hall when she had knelt before him, the same one he would give a colleague passing him in a corridor, unremarkable and unhurried. Then he walked through the door, following his ambassador out into the corridor, and was gone. Silvara stood in the emptying hall for a moment after the Terran delegation had left. The noise of the other departing delegates moved around her like water around a stone. She held the data chip loosely in her hand. Outside, she knew, a small gray ship with no decorations and no fleet behind it was preparing to leave the docking bay and make its quiet way back out into the stars. The galaxy had spent 11 years looking at humanity and seeing a cradle world, young, small, unimpressive, something to be amused by or pitied or simply ignored until they figured out how things worked. It had never once occurred to anyone to ask what they had been building in that cradle. Now, standing in the silence of the emptied hall, Silvara understood, and she suspected that before very long, the rest of the galaxy would understand too. Humanity had not come to the Sovereignty Conclave to pledge tribute. They had never intended to pledge tribute. They had come to do exactly what they had done. Walk in quietly, say very little, and leave with something that no civilization had ever walked out of a conclave with before. They had come as equals. And somehow, without anyone quite seeing it happen, that was exactly what they had become. They called us a cradle world. They weren't wrong. Every soldier, every plan, every stubborn refusal to accept the word impossible, it was all built in that cradle. We just never told them what we were building. Recovered Terran naval inscription, date unknown. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Velari Dominion was the most beautiful and most terrifying room in the known galaxy. It sat at the heart of Valar Prime, the capital world of an empire that stretched across 12 star systems and had stood for over 3,000 years. The ceiling was so high that the top of it disappeared into a soft golden mist. The walls were carved from black stone pulled from the cores of dead stars. Every seat, every pillar, every detail in that hall had been built to send one message to anyone who walked inside. You are small, and we are not. The Sovereignty Conclave happened once every 100 years. It was the event where every civilization in the known galaxy was expected to come forward, bow their heads, and acknowledge the power of the Velari Dominion. Some came willingly, some came out of fear. A few had tried not to come at all, and those civilizations were now footnotes in history books. This year, there was one name on the guest list that had caused a small but noticeable stir among the Velari court planners: Earth. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 11 years ago. 11 years! Most of the civilizations sitting in that hall had been sailing between stars for centuries. The Dravari had been spacefaring for 800 years. The Salin Collective had been exploring the galaxy for over 1,000. The Velari themselves had ruled the stars for 3 millennia. And here came humanity, brand new, barely out of their home system, showing up to a gathering of galactic powers like a child wandering into a meeting of kings. The invitation had been extended not out of respect, it had been extended out of amusement. When the Terran vessel arrived at Valar Prime, the docking controllers had to check their screens twice. The ship was small. Not small in the polite sense, small in the embarrassing sense. It was a single diplomatic cruiser, gray and clean, but completely undecorated. No golden markings, no intimidating weapons visible on the hull, no fleet behind it, just one ship drifting quietly into the docking bay like it had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up here by accident. Several of the alien delegates watching from the observation deck above actually laughed. Ambassador Cole Heron walked off that ship and into the hall with the calm, easy confidence of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove. He was tall, with short dark hair going gray at the temples, and he wore a simple dark blue diplomatic suit with a small tan flag on his left shoulder. No medals, no decorations. He carried a single case in his right hand and nodded politely to the docking crew as if he were arriving at an office building back on Earth. Behind him walked a small team, 2 diplomatic aides, a translator, and one other figure who said nothing and drew no attention to himself at all. The last figure was dressed in a plain gray uniform. He had no medals, no rank markings beyond the same small tan flag patch on his sleeve, and he moved through the space with the quiet, unhurried ease of someone who was simply doing a job. His eyes, however, never stopped moving. They swept every corner of every room they passed through, every exit, every unfamiliar face, every shadow. Nobody paid him any attention. That was exactly how he preferred it. The assembly hall filled slowly over the course of the morning. Delegates from 32 civilizations took their seats on the long, curved benches that rose in tiers around the central floor. There was noise everywhere, the clicking and humming of alien languages being filtered through translation devices, the rustle of robes and the clink of formal armor, the low murmur of politics happening in whispers. The Terran delegation found their seats near the far end of the lower tier, in a section that had clearly been assigned to them as an afterthought. The bench was slightly shorter than the others. The cushions were thinner. Cole Heron sat down, opened his case, pulled out a simple writing pad, and began taking notes. At the front of the hall, raised above all others on a platform of dark polished stone, sat the throne of the Velari Dominion, and seated upon it, straight-backed and cold-eyed, was crowned Princess Silvara. She was young by her species standards, barely 300 years old, but she carried herself with the weight of someone who had never in her life been told no, and had no intention of ever hearing it. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, her robes were deep violet, the color worn only by the ruling line. Her eyes, pale and sharp as cut glass, moved slowly across the room, reading it the way a general reads a battlefield. She let her gaze pass over the Terran delegation with barely a pause.
They were of no consequence. They were here because it was protocol to invite them, that was all. The conclave opened with the traditional recitation of the Dominion's history, 3,000 years of expansion, conquest, and order. A Thari herald read the list of civilizations that had been brought into the fold since the last conclave, 12 new member worlds. The audience applauded at appropriate intervals. Then the presentations began. Each delegation came forward in turn to speak briefly about their people, their contributions to the galactic community, and their continued loyalty to the Dominion. Some gave impressive speeches. The Velari presented a gift of rare mineral charts. The Salon Collective offered a new navigational treaty. Each delegation tried in their own way to look worthy of the room they were sitting in. When the Terran delegation's turn came, Cole Heron stood up, walked to the center of the floor, and gave a short, polite speech. He thanked the Dominion for the invitation. He spoke briefly about Earth's recent entry into interstellar travel. He expressed humanity's hope for peaceful and productive relationships with the civilizations of the galaxy. He spoke clearly, without nervousness, and without any attempt to impress anyone. He then walked back to his seat and picked up his writing pad again. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds before one of the Dravane delegates leaned toward his neighbor and said in a voice just loud enough to carry that he had seen more impressive presentations from first-year diplomacy students. His neighbor made a sound that passed for laughter in their culture. It spread, not loudly, this was still a formal gathering, but the quiet, superior amusement moved through the upper tiers of the hall like a slow wave. The cradle world showed up with one small ship, a polite speech, and nothing else. The galaxy's newest spacefaring species had nothing to offer and nothing to show. They were here because they had been invited, and they had come because they did not understand that the invitation was not an honor. It was a formality, like setting an extra plate at a table for a guest you did not actually expect to arrive. Even Princess Silvara allowed herself a brief, thin smile. She turned to speak quietly to her chief advisor, saying something that her translation filters caught as roughly equivalent to, "They will either pledge tribute by the final session or go home with nothing. Either way, they are not a concern." Her advisor agreed. He agreed completely. At the far end of the lower tier, Cole Heron wrote something in his notes, nodded slightly to himself, and said nothing. Behind him, against the wall, the man in the gray uniform continued to watch the exits. His face was calm, his eyes were steady. He had heard the laughter, he had seen the thin smile from the throne. He had not reacted at all. At the back of the hall, seated alone at a small intelligence station behind a privacy screen, a senior Velari intelligence officer named Overseer Dreneth had been watching the entire thing unfold with an expression that no one else in the room was wearing. He was not smiling. He had pulled up a file on his data slate, a file that required his highest clearance level to access, a file so classified that it had never been shared with the court, the council, or even the princess herself. He had not opened this file in 6 years. He had hoped he would never need to open it again. His hands were very still on the surface of the desk. His eyes moved between the screen and the plain gray uniform standing at the far wall. He said nothing. He closed the file, stood up slowly, and walked toward the private corridors that led to the royal chambers. He needed to request an emergency audience with Princess Silvara. There were things she needed to know before tomorrow. The private corridors beneath the assembly hall were quiet and cold. The walls here were plain compared to the grand hall above, bare gray stone lit by long strips of pale light running along the floor. No decorations, no carvings. These hallways were not meant to impress anyone. They were meant to move people quickly and without being seen. Overseer Dreneth walked through them fast, not running. Running would attract attention, and the last thing he wanted right now was attention. But his pace was sharp. His data slate was tucked tightly under his arm. His jaw was set in the stiff, careful way of a man who is holding something difficult very still inside himself and does not want it to spill out before he reaches the right place. He had served the Velari Intelligence Division for 140 years. In that time, he had handled dangerous information before. He had read reports that kept him awake for weeks. He had delivered news that made generals go quiet and advisors ask to sit down. He was not a man who frightened easily, but this was different. He reached the door to the princess's private receiving chamber, gave the guard his clearance code, and waited. The door opened after a moment. He stepped inside.